Welcome to Belonging Reimagined. I'm your host, Dr. Mona. As a mental health therapist, professor, and researcher, I guide folks in owning their belonging journey and exploring barriers to belonging. In this podcast, I explore real stories with phenomenal guests about how to experience both interconnection and interdependence. And my hope for you is that you learn ways to experience more connection in the world around you and the world within yourself. We don't have to do this life thing alone. You're right where you belong. Okay, we have on today's podcast, Asha Frost. And I had the great pleasure of briefly meeting Asha a few months ago. And I'm so excited to have you now on the show today after meeting you several months ago. As soon as we met from our mutual friend at a conference, I just immediately saw this light around you as you were walking up, and your energy was just kind of flowing through the room. So seamlessly and with such ease. And there's just a quality about you, Asha, that I think we all aspire to find within ourselves, our own version of that. And that is just this ease and light that you have that is so beautiful, so beautifully modeled. And I really appreciate that you're willing to show up like that in the world, because for people who never even have the great pleasure of meeting you like I did, even if it was just for that brief moment, you show us how we can show up in the world, which is with this warmth and kindness and brightness that honestly brings tears to my eyes just to describe. And I'm really, really thrilled and honored to have you on the show today to talk about a subject that's really dear to me, which is belonging while Indigenous. And, we have a mental group practice here in North Carolina, which has quickly grown to be one of the largest in the state. I think it's the largest actually at this point. And we have a wide array of ethnic backgrounds, sexual identities, and just people from different demographics in general in our practice. And having had the great, again, honor of having a student in our practice who trained with us, who was a former student of mine, a graduate student, when I was a professor for this one class that we both were in together. He identifies with the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. And from him, it was just like kismet, where I was able to meet this person and learn so much and realize how much I don't know. And while he is not representative of an entire population of people, it certainly opened my eyes to just my sheer ignorance. And this friendship developed between the two of us over the last few years. I've been able to have a world opened up to me that has been really, really amazing. And some align with his experiences and some don't. And so I'm excited to have you here today to learn more about your experiences, with the understanding that you are not here to speak for an entire group of people, just like I, as an Egyptian American woman, cannot do that as well. And thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. What a beautifully heart-opening, just heart-opening words for me. Thank you.
Yeah. In the conversations around Indigenous identity, there's a lot of focus on trauma. There's a lot of focus on the pain that has happened on Indigenous land, on First Nations land. And there's not enough awareness around this pain and the trauma that is subsequently has occurred, and this really harmful impact that colonization, for example, has had. But there's becoming increasing awareness that, there are things that we don't know. It's always like, okay, I know that there are things I don't know, and I am taking responsibility to dig deeper into that. That is the mindset of not enough people, but some people. But one of the things that, I'm realizing is really not discussed very much is the joy that can come from Indigenous culture And so I would love to learn from you, Asha, from your own personal experiences of some of the ways that you have experienced joy as an Indigenous woman specifically.
What a beautiful question. And that's not asked very often. There's so many ways I experience joy. And the one way that feels the most rooted to me is being in the presence of my Indigenous kin and honestly hearing their laughter. And they have great senses of humor. There's just a lot of laughter in those spaces and a very shared understanding, I think, of how we've moved through that generational trauma into a space of resilience and joy and cultivating those moments of laughter and lightness and beauty and taking all of those elements and aspects of our ancestors and carrying those forward as well. So I'd say those moments of laughter in shared community and also shared moments in ceremony, shared moments in places like powwows where there's dancing and music and drumming, all of those things lighten my heart. They help me to remember connection. They help me to remember my ancestors and the songs they carried and the words that they move forward towards me and my generational joy. So those are the moments that I see in my children's eyes when we go to these spaces and places. To me, looking into my children's eyes and hearts is Indigenous joy because they carry less trauma than I have and I did. So I see the healing moving forward in their hearts.
When you're talking about generational joy,
Mm,
that lights up so brightly as you
mm,
say that. And there's so much that I've learned, at least in my own culture and with my colleague that I was talking about, we've learned one of the things that we have in common, our cultures have in common is storytelling. And there's so much that comes through in storytelling that can bring that thread of joy through the generations, hearing about our ancestors from long ago. I love to hear like the ways that my great grandmother, for example, would handle, conflict in the household and hear specific stories about that. Are there certain stories like that for you that come up?
I think that there are many stories like that. I think there's lots of, again, I think that there's something about the kin that I am surrounded with, my family, my own ancestors that really try to extract or take out some of those really beautiful moments of joy, whether that's through speaking our language. Like I remember my grandfather would speak his language and it was taken from him at quite an early age. But when he spoke it, he would laugh and he would laugh with his friends as they would speak Ojibwe. I wouldn't understand what they were saying, but I could tell that just connecting to who they were through their language brought them so much joy. So my understanding is seeing people that I'm close to and loved really rooted in those cultural aspects that were taken away, that reclamation and the stories of reclamation brought back the joy in some way, even if I was just observing them, because I'm very close to the generations that was taken from. So I think my generation actually is part of bringing back that joy. That's what I see as part of my purpose and weaving that through and moving that into my children's generation. So it feels like an interesting walking in both worlds almost, where the generation before me still holds a lot of that trauma. And I think that I can notice the little moments of joy that came forward as they were reconnecting and reclaiming those aspects that were taken away.
Mhm. And then being able to build on those little bits that you are able to get and expand that, it sounds gives you that sense of connection to your children, like you're saying, interpersonally. And then also that reclamation of self
Mhm,
in terms of like your own heritage.
mhm,
And that makes me think of, when we look at the four types of belonging and belonging
mhm,
integration model, the self, interpersonal, community, and universal, that our heritage and our ancestral stories, they really live in that universal belonging, feeling like you're part of something that is bigger than you. And so, what I'm hearing from you is through the storytelling, you're able to stay connected to your heritage and create that universal belonging, but also that reclamation of self and passing that through to your children interpersonally and to your families. and even as a spiritual teacher to the students that you work with and community, um, really allows you to have that deeper connection overall in what we call belonging
Mm,
in so many different spaces, just from that one little nugget of expanding on joy alone.
mhm,
And so, if there were other generational gifts, as Dr. Meryl Bouquet talks about intergenerational gifts, other intergenerational gifts that you have, I mean, I just even imagine that that makes that sense of connection even deeper just from
mm.
taking from those.
I love that so much. And I do try to find joy, or I do feel joyful in my body as an embodied experience when I'm practicing things that are, in my opinion, re indigenizing spaces, whether that is storytelling, whether that is sitting with the land, just different dreaming, daytime dreaming, nighttime dreaming, bringing back those very indigenous ways of living and being that have been colonized from us. I feel
Mm.
so joyful practicing those things. So I'm hoping that that is passed down to my children. And I think that as we gather in community and practice those decolonial, re-indigenized ways of being, that thread of joy is always there because spirit brings that in as we reconnect.
You know, when you said re-indigenizing, oh, I just got goosebumps because I'd actually never heard that term before.
Mhm.
And in the past, I've used the word decolonizing quite a bit, but it still centers colonization. And I've been trying to find a way because naming is so important, the way we name things and the way we name experiences. And naming this is as a reclamation, re-indigenizing. That is a reclamation. And I'm 100% going to copy and paste that one because that it's so important to have some kind of language to name what an experience is. It helps contain in some way. And then within that container, there can be flexibility and expansion. I don't know if that resonates at all with you.
Definitely. I think there's been a huge focus on decolonizing, which I think is really important work to do. And perhaps part of my stepping out in the joy aspect, the indigenization of spaces and places, as you mentioned at the beginning, presence. I think we can indigenize spaces simply with our presence and the internal work that we've done to reclaim and remember and come home to that belonging internally starts to seep out of our pores and our skin. And to me, that is re indigenizing a space. It doesn't have to necessarily be in our actions or our words, it can be in our presence. That has been a teaching that I've carried with me for a long time.
Mm. Because when we think of indigenous beyond as a people, but as a concept,
Mhm,
it really speaks to being a first,
mhm.
being the beginning of something. And I I can't help but circle that back to going back to the core of who we are. Because what I'm hearing from you, and truly tell me, Asha, if I'm misunderstanding, that we don't necessarily have to be identifying as an Indigenous person in order to re indigenize ourselves. Is
Yes.
that correct?
Yes, and again, that's my one Indigenous viewpoint. I know there's many Indigenous people that wouldn't see it that way, but because the folks I primarily work with are not Indigenous people, I see their indigenous soul and their spirit. I see their intention to reclaim that indigeneity within their own roots. And I think maybe that's gotten misplaced and they're reaching out to indigenous people to find those. And I'm trying to redirect them to say, actually, there's indigeneity in your own ancestors, in the lands that you come from, in the culture and the songs and the stories that your ancestors told. If you're drawn and attracted to our ways of being, let's redirect you to those ways and find that medicine, perhaps within my teachings, to activate that remembering and bring you back home to those places and spaces where your roots can really dig deep. So I do see the indigenous nature of many people in my spaces.
Mhm. So many folks do not have the luxury of knowing what their ethnic roots are even. And I wonder how you respond to that. Folks who might not know, especially here in the US.
Mhm. Yeah, a lot of people say to me that they feel so fractured in that way. So a lot of the work that I do is to invite in the mending because I think that we all have access to what is in our bones and our blood and our sacred waters, which I see as the re-indigenizing of our space. We can sit with the land and listen to our sacred waters. We can dream and invite dream time to be a teacher and a wisdom offering to us. I do believe those answers are within us. We have to just learn how to listen in a different way, which I think that Indigenous people have done for many, many years and many lifetimes. So you're right, it is a luxury and a privilege and a gift to have a mended sort of fracture line, connecting us to our ancestors, as many Indigenous people do. And I do believe that everybody can, if we have the intention, we can get there. Our ancestors are speaking to us in many ways. We just have to learn how to hear them.
Mhm. And it doesn't necessarily have to be rooted to, a specific country or that specific culture. It could be the culture of your family that you know. It could be the culture of what you feel from the earth and from nature. Um, it can be in so many different ways. And so what I'm hearing from you is that there's room for creativity. It's not just one set way.
No, no, because people I think, well, I must do that DNA test and see who they are and find their pictures and find their stories. And that's definitely one way. I think that's important to do that research. And I think that they're waiting. The sense that I get as we're speaking is they're coming really close and they're speaking and saying, but we're even seen in the wind through the trees and we're seen through the flower that grows. Like, how can you open and expand in a curious way? I think curiosity is a beautiful aspect of people when they carry that. And I think there's just different ways of accessing that knowledge that maybe we're not seeing.
I touched on culture for a moment there, and I'm wondering, as an Indigenous spiritual teacher, Asha, can you tell us a little bit about where culture and spirituality meet? A little more about that intersection of the two.
Hmm. I can only speak from my experience because since my path, I sort of got this awakening happened. I was sick when I was 17. I was diagnosed with lupus, and that really opened up and expanded my spiritual path and the unfolding of and the evolution of where I am today. And at the time, I was so disconnected from culture because I was desperate to assimilate because I grew up in a very racist town and racism in the 80s was very present. It still is today, but it was much more present then. So I tried to separate myself from all aspects of culture when I was young and as a teenager. And when I reconnected to those parts of myself, then it was like my spiritual energy came really on board and really online. And something happened in me that was like an awakening, which was beautiful. I don't know if that happens for everybody. I think my ancestors were waiting. I do believe that everybody's ancestors are waiting to connect to those parts. And what I hear from so many folks is there is that moment always where there's an opening, a fracture, a breaking apart, so that the spiritual energy comes through in a more profound way. So for me, it's very connected to my culture and the whispers of my ancestors as they were calling me onto my path. But I can only speak for myself in that way. I hear that's true for some people.
Yeah, yeah, and all of this is only speaking for yourself.
Mhm.
By the way, yeah, it's interesting. I actually grew up also in a very racist town. It was the home of the Ku Klux Klan,
Mm.
and it had giant billboards. To this day, if you do a Google search for my hometown and put the word "sign" SIGN, you can click on the images and see these giant billboards, and it's haunting, to still have them out there on the internet, or to even have them out there ever on the internet because they were there long before there was an internet. And I definitely was trying my best to assimilate. I abandoned my parents' native language. They immigrated here from Egypt,
Mm.
and I wanted, in so many ways, to be anything but a curly headed brown little girl, um, who was scrawny with big green eyes, and really felt like there's nothing about me that looks like anyone around me here, because it was very segregated in terms of, you're either black or white and you better stick to your crew. And so I didn't know where I fit in there.
Mm.
And that abandonment of culture is so harmful for so many of us. And it can be very difficult to re-indigenize ourselves when we're abandoning our cultures and we're trying to be somebody that we're not. And that's why we're like, even back to saying, like, if you run out and get a DNA test, that's not necessarily going to be the answer for you. But
Mhm.
it's interesting the way that you describe the process of merging the two, because mine was very similar. It was when I was about 18 years old. There was a fracture in some aspects of my life. And a spiritual awakening kind of came through that crack. And with that came the voice of my grandmother, who passed when I was 14. And it really felt painful when she passed at 14. And at the same time, I needed her voice with me all the time, which only would have been possible had she passed on in spirit. It felt at that time for me. And that was, really the process of bringing those two together for me. And then I wanted to learn the language, and participate more in the cultural activities. And now, if anyone's on YouTube, and they're able to see behind me, I always have, and all throughout our home, aspects of my culture and Egypt that keep me connected back to, myself. But the interesting part is that it was the culture itself, through the universal belonging, that ushered me into more of like wanting to hang out with my family and my cousins more. So it ushered me into community belonging, and I started making more interpersonal relationships and being closer with people within my family who lived, afar. And so there was more interpersonal belonging there. And all of that really ushered me back to myself again. There was a process there. And it sounds like yours might have been a little different, but some similarities there in many ways.
Yeah, when we speak about belonging from my experience and Indigenous experience, it gets a bit complicated. I think a lot of trauma around our belongings. So there's still a
Mhm.
lot of conversation around blood quantum and acceptance around that.
Yeah.
And so every Indigenous person I speak to, no matter how much blood quantum they might have, and I know it's a very colonial construct, has this wound of I'm not Indigenous enough. And I
Mhm.
find it really fascinating that no matter who I talk to, that is the great fear that somehow right now there's a lot of people being called out for identifying as Indigenous, and then people are researching their genealogy to make sure that it's legit. So it's an interesting dynamic to really step out and root down and claim this when there's these opposing forces saying, are you enough? How much blood do you have? Who are your family members? What nation claims you? That's a lot of question I get a lot is what nation claims you on defense. It's almost like you're constantly just thinking, I have to prove myself and prove my indigeneity in some way to all of these voices because there's so much trauma there that
Mhm.
has separated us from who we are. So the belonging piece, I think, is still very alive in me in that way. And I think for a lot of Indigenous folks in so-called Canada, we would speak to that in a similar way.
Mhm. Mhm. And so is the answering, I'm curious, to other people who identify as Indigenous?
Sorry, say that again?
Are the questions coming from other people who do identify as Indigenous and wanting to make sure that you're enough to fit in, or that
Yeah.
you belong in that space?
Yes. It's always from
Mhm.
Indigenous voices. Yeah.
Wow. And that can create that cultural homelessness, I imagine, for many folks.
For many folks. And I think even a fear because we've been fractured so much from language and culture and ceremony. And even it was illegal to practice many of our ceremonies not that long ago, then all of that was lost. So on that journey of reclamation, there's that fear of who am I going to reach out to? Who is going to teach me this? There's no elders that are surrounding me here. We don't grow up in that community anymore. So there's this fear of even approaching anybody or asking because of that not enoughness feeling. So I see that a lot when my cards came out. Actually, a lot of younger millennial age or Gen Z age Indigenous folks, Two Spirit folks reached out and said, I haven't had anybody to learn from. And I didn't expect that people would reach out at that age level and say, this is part of my reclamation, part of my reconnection, because I haven't had anybody to learn from. And that is what makes it worth it for me, because
Mhm.
I have felt that my whole life. And to know that there's younger generations that are learning different ways just through the medicine I'm sharing. It might not be from their First Nation or their tribal teachings, but it's awakening something in them that's a remembering and part of their belonging.
Oh, that's so beautiful. It really is. Being bicultural myself, my research is in bicultural identity. And that's coming from a recent immigrant background. And so it sounds almost opposite from being indigenous. And at the same time, many people who are indigenous with indigenous identities feel as though they're treated as if they are not part of the dominant population because they aren't part of the dominant population. And so they have similar experiences as being bicultural in the research that I did. And
Mhm.
that aspect of not feeling like I belong is a big part of what can fracture the identity, which is what led to this model that I developed. Actually, it kind of spun off into belonging, as well as being distanced from the language itself, and that can further deepen that kind of chasm between in the identity itself. And one of the things that comes up as you're talking is that the research that I showed was that there's a real spike in interest in wanting to learn more about one's culture in that kind of younger 20s, mid 20s time frame. And so that really aligns with what you're talking about. So psychosocially, it seems to be something that's going on as well. Like, oh, I really want to know who I am more, and so there's some kind of excavating that happens as well as some exploration. And so along those lines, the work that you do, Asha, centers quite a bit on creating different resources for spiritual teachers. And spiritual practitioners, rather. So let me start
Mhm.
that over. A lot of the work that you do, Asha, focuses on creating resources for spiritual practitioners. And you connect a lot of these practitioners with indigenous spirituality as you have experienced it and as you see it. So you're essentially helping the helpers, right? So you're an educator in that way. Um,
Mhm.
so that makes you a spiritual teacher, right? And so
Mhm.
you're helping the helpers. And so I'm curious what kind of sparks your desire to move towards becoming a spiritual teacher in addition to being a practitioner?
Yeah, so I was in the healing role for 15 years. I had a private practice as a homeopath, which then evolved into more Indigenous healing and ceremony, kind of shamanic work, and I loved that. But there's always this little spark that's saying this is evolving. It's that butterfly self, right? That says something is dying here, something is transitioning, something is evolving and being birthed through you. And I felt this call to take it into a bigger, more global teaching capacity. I didn't know how that was going to unfold necessarily, but I kept getting burnt out. So I got burnt out over and over again doing certain things. And I just thought, this needs to change. I want to reach more people. I want to help them return to their own medicine so they can expand their own reach and their connection to humanity. And so that's really how it evolved. And I just keep listening to the call. We do that. We listen, we sit with it. It takes a little bit of time to root down sometimes. And then I tend to just leap out and take those leaps and test it out and see if it works. And so that really, I had this letter called Dear White Woman Who Wants to Be Like Me, based on cultural appropriation. And I didn't realize that would go viral, but it did. So it was a walking through fire initiation of that bigger, I wanted a bigger platform. And then Spirit said, okay, well, here you go. Here's the vehicle to do that. And it was very unsettling because there was many people who didn't love it. And it got me to that bigger visibility and space where more folks were curious about what I had to say and about my identity as an Indigenous person and what I've been walking through for the last, 15 years.
You know, earlier this year, I interviewed one of your fellow Hay House colleagues, Dr. Giovanni Washington, and she's
Mhm.
the author of Black Goddess Within Oracle Deck. And one of the things that she brought up is that there are many white folks who come up to her and say, "Hey, I'm really interested in this deck that you have, this Oracle deck, but I am scared that I'm appropriating in some way Black culture." Have you had any of those questions about the past deck that you made, the Sacred Medicine Oracle one, and then the one that you have coming up that's available for pre-order? So
Mhm.
have you had any questions from folks about that where they have concerns that they might be appropriating Indigenous culture?
Yes, many people have had that concern. And I didn't really think at the time when I created it that it would be that way, because what I see is a lot of Indigenous teachings being taught by white women, and nobody ever worries about that. So I thought, well, there's an Indigenous
Mhm.
person actually sharing that. So
Yeah.
it's coming from this source. Why would you even worry about that when you're okay taking and extracting from our culture from other teachers that aren't rooted to our lineage? So that comes up a lot, especially because I had all these discussions around appropriation versus appreciation. And I thought I was clear about, well, my work is for everyone. And this is what, can you hold all of this at once as you're using these
Mm.
teachings, as you're invoking your own medicine from my teachings? But of course, not everybody reads everything and sees everything. So I do have a lot of those questions. And what I say is these are really meant to be a catalyst to return you to your own belonging, your own medicine, your own ancestors. It's not to become an identical me, a mini Asha Frost. That's not what I'm creating. And I've just over the 20 years of having my business, I've had so many of the same questions and the same things come up and rise that I wanted to develop something to say, here you go. Here's a tool that you can use. And I hope it's an awakening for you. And I hope that the medicine stirs something in you as that remembering. And of course, I have no control how people are going to use it after that.
And it does feel like medicine. I mean,
Yeah.
I know medicine is in the name of both of your decks, but it does feel like medicine. It
Mhm.
feels like the kind of medicine that it's shared through storytelling in the way that it's used in indigenous, First Nations lands and communities, in that medicine is not necessarily this Western concept of like taking a pill. It can be a thought, a way of being. It could be a new approach to life. It can be a, a healing between two people. There's so many different ways to have medicine that essentially is an antidote to help us heal in some way, some type of fracture or some kind of injury.
Mhm.
And when we are fragmented from ourselves, when we are fragmented from our cultures, when we are disconnected from one another, that's an injury that needs medicine. And I can tell you, I have gone to the Sacred Medicine Oracle deck many times before I had even met you, as
Mhm.
Asha Frost, and I had gone to it and I found it so healing. And just something where I could pull a card and I just feel like I have some direction for that day.
Mhm.
And it instantly, as I look at the card and sit with it, and read the guidebook that's with it, I instantly feel this kind of like locking back in, almost like a recentering back into myself again. And I feel this energy kind of come up through me, like rise up and almost lock in my sense of self. It
Mhm.
is such a medicine. It really, really is, because we live in a world and in a society specifically that really not only invites but encourages and oftentimes demands that we self abandon. Um, and you have been such a healing force to counteract that messaging. Truly.
My goodness. As you were describing that, what I could see energetically is that soul retrieval. And that's always what I would hope, that the pieces that have been fractured can be called back, reclaimed, realigned, rooted down again. And perhaps it's not after the first time, but it's after practicing and using it that there's reminders, because we're all just practicing every day, I think, not abandoning ourselves. I love the way that you've described that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I've said over and over, self abandonment is one of the worst forms of abandonment. And so when we have teachers like you who are helping us reclaim who we are, meaning our values and what's important to us, and remembering, as you said, who we are, pausing, reflecting, reclaiming. That is how we can come back home. Truly, it really is. We don't have to leave ourselves, even
Mm.
if we're not in environments that tell us, you're not welcome here. Even if we're in even if we're in environments that tell us you're not welcome here in some way, we can at least have a knowing of who we are. We don't have to show everybody all the time because it's not always safe, but we can have that knowing. And that's what I find that the work that you do leaves me feeling, is with a sense of knowing. And
Mm.
it's just beautiful. So I just appreciate you. I really do. Are there more indigenous spiritual practices that you're aware of, or that you use, that you would almost like wish or encourage more people to incorporate in their own lives, to give them that sense of connection, whether it's with themselves or other people or with some kind of purpose?
Yeah, the things that rise immediately are very simple. And I believe some people do these things as standing on the land barefoot, lying, tummy to tummy, belly to earth belly, taking some breaths there, listening to drumming. In our teachings, the drum is like that first heartbeat that we hear in our first waters. And that's not just, I guess, rooted in our culture, but I think that it's a beautiful way of reconnection. Taking a few moments a day in those ways, noticing the sacredness in all things, like even our water, right? Noticing that we're made of 70% water and the moon moves our water. So being in connection and relationship with all of creation. And I say relationship because I think that's what's lost, is we feel like we have dominance over, or they don't have a spirit, and all of creation has that spirit. How can we see that and nurture that and cultivate that relationship with all of creation that we interact with every single day? I think that brings a humility. I think that brings grace. And I think that brings peace, because we can feel the heartbeat in all things.
Oh, it just gives me pause. It really does. I live in a place where there are quite a bit of hurricanes. I'm in the
Mhm.
southeastern US. And when I hear you talk about like this idea that we have a dominance over things, I'm just picturing all of us having that moment, and like realization that we don't, and running to the grocery store and getting, whatever. I'm not sure why it's always, bread, eggs, and milk. I don't know if people are making French toast or what's going on. But we don't have to wait for the hurricane, whether it's literally or figuratively, to come in for us to have that level of humility, and to be really at one with nature. And even like, as you said, the water in our bodies, and the water in the ocean, and the moon moving the tides. I mean, there's just something so beautiful about being in deep connection and being in flow. That's what comes in, which really circles back to the way that initially saw you. I mean, that's the word that I use to describe you, as there's this flow about you as you move through the world. That's so beautiful. Thank you for, again, modeling that for us. And my favorite question of the podcast always ends with, um, what does belonging mean to you?
It's a very embodied answer. And it feels like a breath. It feels like spaciousness within my cells and my sacred waters. It feels like grace and peace. I can just feel all of my sacred waters like sparkling, and I remember that I'm made of stardust. That's what it feels like.
Made of stardust. I'm going to sit with that answer for a really long time. I really mean that. I really am. Sitting with your sacred waters, and just the language that you use. Well, it might sound so simple, as you said earlier, as far as different practices. I think that's the beauty in it. I think that's really the beauty in it.
Mm.
Beautiful, Asha. Thank you so much for being with us today. I appreciate having you on the show. And I really do hope to connect with you again, because there's a lot more I feel like we have to talk about. I really do. So thanks again.
I'd love that. Thank you so much for having me. It's been such a gift.
Such a gift for me as well. Thank you so much for joining us for today's episode. All of the show notes and links can be found on my website at drmonalora.com. That's MONANOUR.com. Throughout most episodes, you'll hear me referring to the belonging model that I developed, which is represented by a belonging life map that helps you explore areas in your life where you feel more connection and areas where you might feel more isolation. And you can get a free copy of your own belonging life map on my website. Again, that's drmonanour.com. If you like the Belonging Reimagined podcast, please subscribe and consider leaving us a review. That can help more folks find us and keep more episodes coming. Until next time, I'm Dr. Mona. You're right where you belong.